relationships, and it went through over generations, and there were names that were shared. And, I mean, lots of nuances that if anybody has roots and has studied their roots coming from enslaved family or those that would enslave others, you know that there's many different aspects of it, and it just kind of makes up who America is. And then the Civil War, really sort of was needed to eventually get that over the line, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's really interesting. Richard Henry Lee was such a strong voice for liberty. He was such a strong voice for liberty for all. In his maiden speech, he condemns right away. In his maiden speech for in the House of Burgesses, he condemns um, uh, slavery. Right, the act of owning people. He calls it out and says this is insidious. We should not be continuing this. And but it takes more than it's like an all or nothing thing, right? It has to go away, right? And so I see him on the freedom side of things when the Declaration of Independence is put together. They go through a few drafts of the Declaration of Independence. You can see that Thomas Jefferson, when he's done with it at first, and you guys remember the movie 1776? It's this musical, right? In the musical, like I think we saw this the other day when we were watching with our kids, when we were kind of doing our unit study with our kids.
Fair
And
warning, don't watch with your kids.
yeah, that one. There's a lot of there's a lot of innuendo. There's a lot of adult humor. Let me put it that way.
Yes, most of the time
There
they
is.
won't catch it, but there are those things that you're like, oh, that was too
Yeah,
close for
yeah.
comfort.
It's too close. But I think it actually portrays it kind of well. Is just that, the original intention of the Declaration of Independence is to declare that all people are free, right?
Yeah.
They were serious about the tenets that all men are created equal and are endowed by their creator certain inalienable rights, and of these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they meant everybody. However, the big however is that they were participating in slavery, right, at the time. And so they couldn't have both. If they didn't bring all of the states along, then it would fall apart, and they needed independence first. And so then
Right.
the next part would have to come later, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. We know that, right? Even though he was advocating for this, just as
mhm,
Henry Lee was. And I mean, a great example to me is you go to Mount Vernon.
mhm,
George Washington,
mhm,
he owned enslaved people.
that's
So
right.
did his wife, right,
Mhm,
Martha. Now he could control this. He could control what happened to them after he died.
mhm,
So he put in his will that when he died, all of his enslaved people were free. And in
mhm,
fact, that's what happened. They were free. His wife handled it differently, and they were not free, and they were sold off. So people ended up having to make their own individual choices about because it wasn't able to be addressed at that larger level the way that you're describing.
right,
It was
exactly.
it was emotional. It was difficult. There was fiery debate.
Mhm,
People felt strongly. Henry Lee felt strongly. Thomas Jefferson felt strongly, and yet again, at the end of the day, they just didn't have the votes.
right.
They just didn't have the support. You couldn't pull this off unless all 13 colonies joined up and said, we're doing this.
Mhm.
And they couldn't get that and the abolition of slavery at the same time. And they had to make a call. And so they essentially kicked it down the road to the next generation to figure out, which we know eventually led to the Civil War.
It's interesting. I was just looking at one of the delegates I think it was for South Carolina, one that was for maintaining enslaved people, right? Like for maintaining slavery. And it's interesting because his family, like his wife and his I think his son-in-law, etc., they become some of the more revered uh, abolitionists, right? And he ends up only with uh, one enslaved person in his estate by the time he passes away.